Hello, welcome back to John's Bible study. We're just going to move into John chapter 18 today. And this next bit, we're really going to have to follow the storyline and just see what we can understand and pick out of the story as it goes through. If you remember, Jesus has just finished praying. He's just finished a considerable time of speaking to the disciples. He's been really laying out to the disciples, this is what's happening, this is what's going to happen. And the disciples who had no grid of reference to any of it really struggled to understand. But Jesus understood that, and he was laying out something that wasn't necessarily to them of immediate value, but would be something that, as time went on, the Holy Spirit would bring things up and remind them and enable them to enable them to process things, enable them to not just find a place of peace, but we see statements later on. It's like they've remembered what Jesus has said and gave them that firm foundation. So we're going to pick up in, say, John chapter 18. I'm going to read it and then I'll pick out little bits as we go through. So Jesus had just finished praying. It says he left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. I just remind us again that the journey that Jesus went on, even the walking and where he walked, was a journey led by the Spirit. I've been thinking a little bit about this myself in just the last week, and you think of those moments where it can only be God that organises things. We had one of those just a few days ago. My wife and I had to go down south, and we were going to Cheltenham, and we decided we'd stay overnight in Cheltenham. It's actually where my daughter lives, but she was so busy, didn't have time that evening, wasn't even in Cheltenham that evening to see us. So we booked a random hotel. First thing that was just incredible is I think I've stayed in Cheltenham once before, and again just randomly picked the best deal hotel. And we walked in and we're like, this hotel seems familiar. And we found out as we were given our room keys and went and stayed in this room, it was exactly the same room as we'd stayed in 7 years with similar circumstances as well. And you're like, it grabs your attention. You're like, that doesn't just happen. That there has to be an element of God in there. And you're like, what is going on? Later on, my wife and I, we went out for a walk, went into the park. Down the park, and the path is surrounded by trees with little gaps in. There's a road running down the side, and suddenly we get a phone call from the daughter who's running. She says, "Look behind," and there she was coming up behind us. A friend had been driving her up the road, and she looked across and between the trees and just said to the friend, "I think that's my parents." She had no idea. She knew we were in Cheltenham, but no idea where we were staying. And you're like, that can only be God, that split second timing. And why am I telling those stories? I just want us to recognize that Jesus was walking by the Spirit, we walk by the Spirit, and God is able to bring split second timing, making things happen. Yeah. So here's Jesus, he's split second timing, going with his disciples, he's finished his praying, he's crossing the valley, and he's got a destination. It says on the other side there was a garden, and he and the disciples went into it. Now, at just that moment, now this looks like a disaster, but we have to recognize there's a journey and a purpose of God. It says, now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas is on a collision course. He's already been set up, hasn't he? Earlier he left the disciples and he planned because of money to betray Jesus. But this is part of the bigger picture that Jesus had to be betrayed. And you think, oh, why Judas? But there's stuff going on in his heart that just meant that he hadn't engaged with Jesus in the way he should have done, and really in the way he had every opportunity to. And so Judas arrives in the same place. Yeah. And when he got to the garden, it says he's coming with a detachment of soldiers, some officials from the high priest and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. When you actually look at that, you're like, they were expecting a battle. They're expecting, a bit of a fight. They they clearly felt that the disciples would um, turn around and maybe attack them. I don't know what exactly they were expecting, but that's what's going on. I guess you bring a detachment of soldiers. They didn't want to mess this up, did they? And on previous occasions when they tried to get Jesus, through the crowd, he'd done all sorts of things. But this moment's different because it's the moment that God has decided is the right time, is the time for Jesus to be delivered up towards the cross. And I think, we have to recognize even that in the timing of God. Jesus says, again in the scriptures linked to the breaking of bread, in the night he was betrayed, he broke bread. It says on the night he was delivered up, or the night he delivered himself up. This isn't God losing control. This is a purpose of heaven being played out here. So they arrived, and an amazing statement. Jesus, knowing what was going to happen to him, went out and asked them. Jesus didn't operate in fear. It's not that he wanted to um, go through with this. It says he endured the cross, scorning its shame. Why? Because of the joy set before him. And so Jesus, knowing all was going to happen, went out, and said to them, "Who is it you want?" I love this next bit because they must have recognised him. They, unless somehow supernaturally he was disguising himself, says, "We want Jesus of Nazareth." It's like, why didn't they just grab him at that moment? And but you remember, Jesus was only going to be delivered up at the moment that he released himself to it. And Jesus' reply says, "I'm he." Um, and Judas, who knew Jesus well, was also standing there. I think this is actually a bizarre, unusual, supernatural thing if they didn't recognize Jesus. And at that moment, when Jesus said, "I'm he," it says they drew back and fell to the ground. There was a power of God coming out of Jesus. There was a power of God being released at that moment. And you look at that and you look at everything going on around. I think in the middle of this crazy moment, Jesus is there. Middle of this crazy, sorry, God, middle of this crazy. Jesus is there. He's not lost control. He's not phased. He's a man of peace, and even in this, he lived a place of peace. It says he asked them again, "Who is it you want?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." I just wonder, was this almost like a moment that, it's hiding in plain sight, and in one more. Jesus said, "I told you that I am he. If you're looking for me, then let these men go." And it says this happened, so it fulfilled the words, "I have not lost one of those you gave." So, disciples, it's almost like at that moment there's this separation that's going between Jesus and the disciples. He's releasing himself into something that the disciples can't follow him, but not just with his words, but probably in the spirit as well. I think he's releasing his disciples to their journey, which is different, his journey. And of course, we're then faced with Simon Peter, who, he reacts. This is the first of his reactions. He's like, "Right, I'm going to fight back. I'm going to, it, it's, it, it must be a moment of rage or anger or something. That yeah, it seems illogical to me. One man doing this, he says he struck the high priest's ear, cutting his ear off, and yeah, you're like, what? In one of the versions, it's like Jesus restores guy's ear. So Jesus' comment was, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup Father has given?" That's a man of peace, isn't it? Peace in the face of extraordinarily challenging you know, situation. Right, we'll finish there. Bless you. Have a great week. Rest of the week. Being with you soon. Bye for now.